This is the I Will Teach You a Language podcast, episode 144.
Welcome to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. Weekly motivation and language learning tips to help you become fluent in any language. Now, here's your host, Olly Richards.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Very happy to have you here. Today we've got an episode all about learning Chinese characters, specifically how one person used Star Wars to learn to read and write Japanese. Very, very interesting. It's a very detailed conversation. Before we get into that, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the show, who are italki. And italki is a place where, speaking of Japanese, in fact, I often take Japanese lessons on italki to keep my Japanese up and not disintegrate too badly. If you would like to get a free lesson with a Japanese teacher or any other teacher on italki, you can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/free lesson. So today I'm very happy to be speaking with Mr. Kevin Richardson, who's from the UK, but moved out to Japan some time ago. We're going to be getting into a lot of different aspects of learning to read and write Chinese. A lot of you will identify with his story, especially if you've ever been through the process. I mean, if you've lived in China or Japan, or if you've been through the process of taking a bit of time to get into a language. So Kevin mentions a lot of different things here, all of which I'll put in the show notes, which will be at iwillteachyoualanguage.com/episode 144, in case you want to dive into that any differently. But now let's get into the conversation with Kevin Richardson. I began by asking him just to describe his background and how he came to move to Japan in the first place.
So I visited Japan in about 1998, and I kind of fell in love with the country. And decided that one day I would learn the language and live in Japan, and then proceeded to do nothing about it for about 14 years. Other things got in the way. I guess about 4.5-5 years ago, just after the big tsunami, kind of Japan got back into my mind. And I thought, okay, I'll start learning Japanese. And very, very slowly, without having any plan, etc., I just kind of bumbled away for a best part of a year without making too much progress. And I think it was through Benny Lewis, listening to a few talks by Benny Lewis, that I thought, okay, this guy is onto something about actually speaking the language. And one thing led to another. So I started speaking Japanese on IWTYAL. And then I joined the Ad1 Challenge. And I learned a lot through doing the Ad1 Challenge, mostly about just having a routine and doing something consistently. And I saw myself actually make some progress and kind of amazed myself that I could actually make conversation with native Japanese people.
Yeah, so you kind of had that realization, I guess. You realized that, hey, I can actually speak Japanese, right?
Yeah.
And then you ended up moving to Japan, is that right?
Yeah, it was... I thought that... really, I was learning Japanese because I wanted to live in Japan. So I kind of said to myself, I won't actually move to Japan until I can actually make basic conversation in Japanese. So I sort of set myself a goal of, okay, I really want to do this, but I'm not going to just move there because I might just fall into the trap of moving to Japan and going, oh, people will speak English with me, great, and not actually speaking the language. So I sort of said, okay, once I'm able to make basic conversation, I can justify my move to Japan.
So you moved to Japan, and then you started. I guess you got a job there, and you started kind of living your life. Did you start learning Kanji, or even hiragana and katakana from the beginning? Or when did that really kind of hit?
Okay, so hiragana, katakana, I learned very much at the beginning, which was pretty useful. Now, I know a lot of people say that, it helps with pronunciation. I'm not so sure it does. I'm kind of like, well, I did it first and it didn't do me any harm. It impressed the Japanese teacher when I arrived at my first class and I could read the hiragana and katakana. So it's like, ooh, brownie points for Kevin, which is pretty cool. But of course, as you know, you learn hiragana and katakana and you're like, hey, I could do this. And then you have a look at kanji and go, uh-oh, problem. There's a lot of these things and I can't make head or tail of any of it. It can be pretty daunting and pretty frightening, I think.
Did you start learning kanji from the beginning, or was there one kind of moment when did you put it off and then suddenly have a kind of epiphany moment?
I certainly did. I put it off and I put it off. I didn't start learning kanji until the beginning of this year. So after 4 years of learning Japanese, I hadn't really bothered with kanji until the beginning of this year. And the reason this happened was I went on a trip down to Kyushu at Christmas. And
Kyushu is the southernmost island in the southernmost of the big three islands in Japan.
Yeah. And I met a guy down there whose Japanese was pretty damn good. And what I've noticed is often when foreigners speak Japanese, I can understand almost 99% of what they're saying, because I guess they've learned a lot of the high-frequency words that I would have learned. But this guy was speaking on a pretty near-native level. And I thought, I'll ask him, what's your trick? How come you can speak so elegantly? He said, it's because you read a lot. I was like, aha. Okay, so would you say learning kanji really helped you? He said, yeah, it's the key. If you learn kanji, it will unlock the language for you. That was his way of putting it.
So, that's brilliant, and I love those kind of realizations, because it kind of drags you out of your comfort zone, doesn't it? And it makes you realize, I have to change things up here, otherwise I'm just going to kind of just fester along for another few years without making any progress. So, I mean, what I really would like to get into is some of the issues around learning kanji. But before we do that, could you give us a kind of very sort of give us a snapshot of the journey of learning kanji from so where are you at now, and were there any phases along the way from zero, that moment when you talked to that guy in Kyushu, up to where you're at now, and how would you break down your experience so far?
Okay, yeah, right. So where I'm at now is I've learnt the sort of keyword meanings of about 2,000 kanji by using Heisig's Remembering the Kanji book. And then about
how long did that take?
I did it in 6 months. Some people say they can do it in 3 months. I think that's really going for it. I took 6 months, but what I was doing was not only making a mnemonic story for each of the kanji characters, I was also writing out the kanji about 10 to 15 times for each one. And I think what I found was that actually by writing them out, in some respects I thought this will help me be able to write them in the future. But I think the actual process of writing them out slowed me down a bit to make better mnemonics as I was writing them out, and really sort of focused me on what's the story of this kanji? How do the radical parts of this kanji make up the mnemonic? So that I would have a higher attention by doing that than if I just blasted through.
We'll get into that in just a second. But then so you went through this book, Remembering the Kanji, and I'll put all these in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
But you went through that and you learned about 2,000 characters, and it took you about 6 months. And then, was that like the only thing you did? Was it kind of right, heads down, I'm going to get through this book if it's the last thing I do, like closed door, 6 months, or how did it work?
There was a certain amount of that's what I'm going to do when I began, but I think just doing that one thing can get pretty tedious, no matter which way you look at it. So after about 3 or 4 months, I thought, I've been reading Star Wars books. I bought the whole series of the original Star Wars trilogy in Japanese, and it's aimed at teenagers. So by the side of the kanji, there's the furigana, which is the hiragana reading of the kanji. So even though like I might only know a gist meaning to the character, as I was reading Star Wars, I know the stories inside out and backwards. And there's a lot of katakana words, like foreign loan words, like Millennium Falcon or lightsaber, that are written in katakana.
Lightsaber.
Lightsaber. Millennium Falcon. Etc. And I think because if you know the story and you've got the help of foreign loan words, when you see kanji that you understand what they mean, but you might not know how to read them, you're kind of reinforcing the what they mean and also a reading to them as you're reading a well-known story.
So did you spend a lot of time reading the story? I mean, was it just a kind of casual thing, or did you have a structure to that reading?
No, not really a structure so much as I would just try and fit in maybe a page or two a day.
Would you be kind of taking notes and writing down new kanji as you came across them, or was it just a kind of extensive reading exercise where you just read and enjoyed it?
I read and enjoyed it, but I also sat there with a pen, putting a circle around a word that I thought, this is going to be useful. I want to be able to remember this one. This will be useful for me in a conversation, or if I'm talking about Star Wars in a bar. That kind of thing.
And then what would you do later with that? With that stuff that you'd circled, what would you do with? Did you have a procedure that you would go through afterwards to go back to that?
Yeah, I started building up my own decks in Memrise of useful Star Wars related vocabulary.
Nice.
So that I'd have like a spaced repetition system to review and just see if I could recall them.
Okay,
yeah.
So then, so I'm loving this. So I'd like to break this down a bit in a second, but you're getting to a point now where you've got two things going on, right? You've got the Heisig book that you've got Remembering the Kanji that you're working through, and now you've got a deck on Memrise that you also have to revise. Now, did you start to feel at any point like you were dividing your attention, or you were doing too many things?
No, because I mean, there's so many things that you're kind of doing when you're learning a language. Like I'm still kind of maintaining conversation once a week with a language partner. But I would take my Star Wars book in and we'd make some sentences using new words or some new grammar point that I'd learned or something like that. But in addition to this, I started using Akane about 6 months ago. That was about 2 months before I finished Heisig. I kind of overlapped with, okay, I'm kind of wanting to learn more readings now. So I'm on level 10, which I guess is about 1,500 vocabulary words.
And can you tell us what Akane is?
So Akane is a website resource which teaches about 6,000 vocabulary words, but it also, like Heisig, you learn the radicals and then the kanji on their own. And then also, once you've learned a kanji, you'll learn a few vocabulary words that use those kanji. And you start to sort of like notice patterns and how this reading is used in a composite form for a word.
Now, so we're getting pretty technical here, but I do want to just drill down on this one level further, because this is yet another resource that you're kind of using at the same time. So when you started using Wanikani, were you taking the same? Was it like new characters, or were you taking the stuff that you'd already learned from Heisig and from your Star Wars comics?
Aha! So here's the interesting thing. So some people will go, "Oh, okay, I'll learn with Heisig, and then I will start learning on the next level of learning the readings to the same Joyo kanji." So the set of 2,000 odd kanji that the government in Japan say this is what literacy is. So Wanikani also pretty much teaches Joyo kanji, but also adds a hell of a lot of vocabulary words, so that you're not learning these kanji in isolation. You're seeing how they connect and join up with other kanji, which I think is really helpful.
Okay.
Some people might say, well, once you learn the kanji on their own, you'll notice what they mean when they join up with other kanji. Only I don't, or I'll misinterpret. So I think learning vocabulary words in kanji is also really helpful.
Yeah. So I think this would be a good point to kind of take a step back and just kind of look at everything you said as a whole, because you covered so many great stuff and so many great things, and you know, people listening may or may not, I think, understand the significance of this, and it's something that I'm very interested in right now, because I'm learning to read Chinese in a kind of roundabout way in order to help my Cantonese, but it's basically the same progress. That's the same process. And for those of people who are maybe starting to wonder, okay, what's going on here? You started with the Heisig book, which is Remembering the Kanji, and in that book, is it all of the 2,000 and so on and such Joyo kanji, or is it just 1,000?
No. With Heisig's Remembering the Kanji book, I thought I'd be learning 2,136 kanji, which is the Joyo set. And apparently, if you know the Joyo kanji, then you'll be able to read a newspaper and read subtitles, which was kind of like my kind of end goal. If I can get literate and I can read the subtitles of movies, it's going to really help with growing my vocabulary and being able to read along with the audio. So I think the big disadvantage if we cannot have a massive form of input when we're trying to learn a language. Yeah, I felt a bit handicapped, to be honest.
Yeah,
without
but
being able to
but how many characters do you actually learn in that book?
You learn about 2,000.
Okay, so it's you're most of the way there to
actual there. Yeah.
Okay, so the Remembering the Kanji book, it takes you through from the beginning up to, say, around about 2,000 characters. Yeah. But as you touched on earlier, but I think we should make clear, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the system in the book doesn't teach you how to pronounce any of these characters. It just teaches.
That's absolutely right.
It just teaches you to actually recognize them and a kind of root or key meaning to the character, which may or may not have anything to do with the reality of what the character actually means. Is that a fair representation?
On the whole, yeah, absolutely right. You're kind of, I think Heisig's way of explaining it is pretty good, where he says that the reason he wrote this book in the first place was because he noticed how Chinese people were able to learn Japanese very quickly. Why is that? Well, they could understand the meaning of the characters without knowing how to actually pronounce them, how to say them.
Yeah.
And so he went about breaking down the kanji, and he used what they call primitives. Other people say radicals. These are the parts of the character, which is really useful to kind of have an idea about these radical parts and how they make up the kanji. Because with learning that, you're able to make mnemonic stories to build up the kanji as a whole.
It's like an education, isn't it? It's like you're learning, because Japanese Chinese people they learn kind of the ethos of the characters as they learn them. These characters all have embedded meanings, and whether it's kind of pictographic or otherwise. But we don't have any of that as foreigners. And so I really like the approach, because the other element to this is that if you try to learn how to read and write kanji, and learn how to pronounce them, and often these characters have multiple pronunciations which change depending on the word combination. It's like extremely complicated. Like that task is huge, and so you can actually break down the task. And the remembering the kanji method says, all right, let's postpone learning the pronunciation till later, because we're going to be more effective and have more success if we just learn to just learn this world of reading and writing and recognizing these Chinese characters, how they're made up, what their composition is, such that later when we come on to actually use these characters in real words and actually learn to pronounce them, it's going to be so much easier, because we already know how to read and write the shapes themselves. Absolutely.
And the other thing I think is really interesting is you start thinking of the characters in a way that a Japanese or a Chinese person would think about them.
Yes.
It changes your perspective. Like the kanji for star, like hoshi in Japanese, is made up of sun and life. And so you start thinking about, planet, what I say, is like star and another character. And you're like, oh, okay. So you're kind of like looking at the sun is the source of life, and you start thinking about things in an Asian way.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Although I think it's worth pointing out, though, isn't it, that kind of stuff is true to some of the simpler characters, which are more. But when they get complex, like you mentioned mnemonic devices and stories earlier on, and one of the ways that you commit these kanji to memory in the Heisig method is by creating these quite elaborate stories about these different parts, and local, like native Japanese, they don't think that way. They just know the character. But so it's a kind of a bit of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, isn't it? But so taking a step back then, since this method of using of learning the characters by themselves with no pronunciation, I see this as like a bridge to actually learning to use them for real.
Yeah.
But there comes a point where you need to say, okay, I've learned how to read and write these things. Now I actually have to know how to use them and combine them to make words and to pronounce them. And so what I noticed that you've done is that by, whether you realized you were doing it or not, is that by going to your Star Wars comics, what you've done is you've automatically started to bridge the gap between learning these characters as an abstract thing and and actually seeing them used in context. And then by going on to use the Akane that you mentioned, I mean, I haven't used it, I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds like what you're doing is you've kind of instinctively recognized a need to see these characters being used in real life. And so you've kind of come across these two tools which have helped you do that. And so I'm going to guess how the story ends, if you like it, which is that as you continue to do those things, you kind of gradually found yourself sort of being able to understand and use and pronounce and say these kanji as they cropped up in real life around you in Japan, because you were doing those things. Now that's me putting words into your mouth. So is that accurate, or how did it work?
That's pretty true, because like we're talking about, my kind of analogy is that when you plaster a wall, before you actually apply the plaster, you rough up the surface, and that's hating to me. It's like preparing the wall to apply the plaster. Because if you just try and slap plaster on a smooth wall, it just falls off, and that's what was happening before I used Hasty, trying to do everything all at once. It was too much of an overload. I remember nothing.
Here's a question for you, Kevin. Could you, let's imagine you never went to Japan and you were back home in the UK.
Yeah.
Is there any reason that you had to be in Japan in order to achieve this ability in Chinese in kanji that you did? To what extent was being in Japan instrumental in you learning this?
Okay, it's definitely an advantage to be in Japan as you're walking around surrounded by kanji characters. Your interest in trying to actually figure out the meaning of the world around you is always present. So kind of you can't really avoid but go, oh, that's interesting. Oh, because I know what that character means, and I know what that character means, I can put them together and work out, oh, I see how this is working. Now, fair enough. That's great when you're living in Japan, but I wouldn't say it's absolutely necessary, because a lot of this is all coming just by reading a book that's familiar to me, or the story's familiar to me. So you can do it outside of Japan, I'm sure.
I think the other thing to mention is the fact it's not insignificant that you chose those Star Wars comics, because everything you were saying about knowing the story and knowing what happens is a huge leg up in the reading process, because you are, in technical terms, we'd say you're already familiar with the schemata of the text, which means that you already know basically the structure of what's happening, which means you can just focus on the words and the meanings themselves.
Totally. That's so true. The funniest one was when I went to visit this castle, Matsumoto Castle. I met a lot of Japanese castles have volunteers that will guide you around the castle. So I visited this castle, and the Japanese lady that took me around Matsumoto Castle was kind of intrigued. How come I can read all these military kanji?
Why do you know the word for Death Star in Japanese?
Yeah, how come you know the word for soldier or commander or something like that? Yeah, and I'll be like, oh, that comes from Star Wars. So as we walked around, I was kind of like, I kind of know the meaning, I don't know the reading, and then she'd be thinking, well, that's quite a simple, straightforward kanji that like a 7-year-old child would know. You don't know it, but you know all these different ones. I was like, okay. And sometimes I would read a kanji and not know another one, and kind of say, oh, that's familiar. And then we'd flick through my Star Wars book. And if this lady pointed out where this kanji existed in the context of Star Wars, I'd know its meaning. Whereas if I was trying to read just the history on its own, it's a completely new, unknown entity, and I'd be flummoxed completely. I wouldn't have a clue.
Kevin, I had the feeling that we could go on for a long time about this, but I guess what I'd like to ask you in closing is, given you've come a long way, I think, in the 9 or 10 months that you've been learning, and you've clearly been through a journey, which is, I mean, I understand exactly how engrossing and rewarding that journey is. Yeah. Because I went through the same thing when I was in Japan, although I never got quite as far as you in terms of volume of characters. Where do you, assuming that you're staying in Japan, where do you how is the next year going to look for you in terms of continuing to learn to read?
Okay.
Do you still have an ambition to continue to learn to read? Is it still as useful and as exciting as it was? And where do you see yourself taking this project?
Okay, so long-term plan. I think it's going to take me about 2 years to reach sort of a fully literate level.
2 more years or 2 years in total?
2 years in total, I think. So about a year and a half before I'm completely fully literate in Japanese. Now, I think my fluency in speaking Japanese has taken a bit of a dive since I've really focused on just reading and listening this year. So basically, once you start learning, the desire just keeps growing. You're like, oh, actually, it might not take me another year and a half to get there. It might just take me another year. I don't know. Because the more you learn, the easier it becomes, I think. I can certainly kind of guess the readings of quite a few kanji at the moment. So it's kind of exciting that you're never quite sure of, well, the more you learn, the easier it gets and the faster it gets. It's like a train that sort of gathers speed, and then once you're on a roll, you're like, whoa, here we go.
I mean, you'd have to suspect that the more you actually the more you're able to actually read real authentic texts in Japanese, the more that you will just learn through osmosis in a natural way. I mean, you'd have to expect. I mean, I can't imagine that. Obviously, there are some less frequent characters which may always be a problem, just like they are for Japanese people themselves. Yeah. But in terms of reading your kind of everyday stuff, I'd imagine it would quite quickly become a lot easier for you over the coming months.
I mean, already, like we're talking about, with Star Wars, I'll happily read away, maybe like 10 pages in an evening. Which when I started, I would maybe read about half a page of an evening. Now I'm reading 10 pages, so I am getting faster and quicker and being able to just like scan the text, like and take in the meaning, even though there's new words there. So I guess the more you do, the faster you get, and you're starting to notice grammar patterns. So it all kind of like feeds into the same thing, which is building up your language muscle.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Kevin. We're going to have you back on in a year and see how far you've come, and maybe give you a little spot test where I'll feed you some newspaper articles on the state of the economy and say, Kevin.
Feed me something on Japanese history at least, or Star Wars.
We'll do Star Wars. How about that? All right. So, Kevin, I mean, you're a very active member of my Facebook group. So, if anyone wants to find you and if they're not already in the Facebook group, then please come on over and join. You can just go to Facebook and search for Olly Richards Fluency Mastermind is the rather pretentious name of the Facebook group, so you can find that there. Kevin, do you have any other social media channels that people can find you on?
Facebook. I don't really do Twitter much. I think Facebook's probably the best thing. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we can people can look you up in the Facebook group if they'd like to ask you any questions, or maybe issue some words of encouragement or even warning. Who knows? Kevin, thank you so much. I know it's late for you in Japan. I really appreciate you coming on the call, and I hope this has been useful for people. All the best for the next 12 months of kanji madness.
Fantastic. Well, it's been totally brilliant speaking with you, Ollie, after all these years. I don't know how many years. I think we met on the Ad One Challenge, didn't we?
Yeah, it's been a while, but no, it's great to talk to you and great to hear how well you're doing as well. So long may it last.
Fantastic stuff, Ollie. Cheers for that.
So I hope you enjoyed that interview with Kevin. It's really fascinating, all the different, his process of just searching and looking for new things, kind of feeling his way, and actually, without realizing it even, actually, happening across a very, very good combination of different approaches that allowed him to make the progress that he has. All of the resources and things that Kevin has mentioned in this episode, you can find in the show notes, which will be at iwillteachyoualanguage.com/episode 144. If you enjoyed this, or if you enjoyed the podcast in general, I'd be very grateful for a review on iTunes. And if you'd like to do that, you can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/review. Alternatively, you can open up iTunes itself and search for the show, and you'll find it right there. Reviews are really great because they help other people find the show and to just generally motivate me to keep making more of them. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you back in the next episode of the podcast.